In this example, what we want to do is take a look at how can we integrate our workflow with information from external systems. So systems that are not located within our SharePoint tenant, we want to use a web request to go and grab that data. So for example, we want to go and grab what the current weather is at a location. And since that's going to be an external service, we need to use the action called web request. So simply look up web request in the actions pane and take that over onto your workflow designer canvas. Double click and we'll take a look at what we have to place in here to make a call out to an external service. Few things are required in here, such as the method and the URL that we need to hit. And so the URL is actually going to determine what is the service that we're trying to make a request to, and then what type of request do we want to make. Are we trying to get some information? Are we trying to put some information? Are we trying to post some information? As you see, you make these selections that the inputs required will change. That's where you'd have to go and take a look at what is the data that I'm actually trying to get, and what is the type of call that I'm trying to make? How is that structured on the receiving end? So what you would do is you would go to the API service. And so in this example, we're looking at Open Weather API. And we go and take a look at the call for current weather data. And so you go over to the API document. And in the API document, it's going to give you an example of how this would actually occur. And so we can see that the API call is structured as api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5 /weather. And then you see this question mark. And so that question mark means we're now going to start placing query parameters after this. And so the first query parameter that it's looking for is city name. And so that's really all you have to put in here. But that doesn't mean that you're actually going to make the call to it. There's a couple other bits that you'd have to place by, such as an application ID. And so we can go down and you'll see some information about getting a little bit more data here. But you'll also see that we're going to have to start putting in what type of parameters we want to return back. Do we want JSON? Do we want XML? How do you structure the call to get in an XML? And so in this example, it's called mode. And we also have to place in the app ID for our API call. And so the app ID is basically the API key that they're going to provide for you. And so with Open Weather Map, what you'd have to do is just log in and generate an API key, and that's free. If you do not already have an account, create an account for yourself, and then once you go in there and take a look at your account page, you'll be able to go and grab your API key. And so that's what you'll use when building out this URL. So looking back at the URL, we want api.openweathermap.org as the first. And so we're going to start that out with http://. So what you'd want to do is go ahead and go back into the workflow itself. And so I've already written out the first parts of this. And so you can see we've got our call for weather. Now what we want to do is put the city in. And so if we looked back at that call, there's a Q, question mark, and then a Q, and then equals. So Q is going to be the city name that we want to place in there. Question mark, Q equals, and then we'll type in Seattle. Now we also need to tell it that we want this data to come back as XML. And I'm passing another query parameter. So it's not another question mark because we've already started that, but what we're doing is we're sending another query parameter. So it's an AND statement. And in this, an AND is just going to be 1 ampersand. And so we're going to say, and the mode that we want is for this to be in XML. And so that will send the data back to us in an XML format. By default, Open Weather Map sends data back in JSON, but we would want to use a query XML action to go and parse that data. And so last but not least, what we need to do is pass our app ID key. And so we'll put that in over here and another equal sign denoting that this is what it's going to be. And then we'll place that app ID key in. So now that's in there. Now it's a get call that we're making to this, and we do not pass any body parameter or username or password to make this call. It's purely held through the credentials of the app ID that we've just used. What we do need to do though is store the response content so we can do something with that. So I've gone ahead and I've already created a variable. And if you don't have one created, simply click on create variable and then you'll be able to create the variable that you need. But I've created it called txt response. And so that is a text type response variable to hold the XML in it. So I'll simply select that and then click on save. If I wanted to just show that data, what I can do is use the log to history list action, place that in, and then I'll be able to go and store that data simply by clicking in here, click in the input box, go to workflow variables and choose text response. And so that way we can actually see the data that's being returned to us. If we need to query the XML that's being returned from the web service call, what you can do is use query XML, place that here. You'll point to the XML as content because it's not existing SharePoint content. It is content. Click on the input box. Once again, reference that text response, place that in here. And then use the XPath that you've learned about to query for that content itself. And you'll want to grab the text. So if you want to go and grab the temperature value, you can use that. So what does that actually look like after you make this call? And how would you know how to parse that? Well, what you'd want to do is go and run the workflow with the log to history just to see what that looks like. And I have an example over here of the Open Weather API test workflow, and this is the value you'd get back. Now remember, the log to history only has so many characters within it, so it will truncate large values returned. So if there's a large amount of content that you're expecting back in the text variable, email that to yourself so that way you can use that to query and then understand what the nodes are that you'll have to go through. So you can see that we've got current, and then under current you'd want to go down and go and take temperature and then temperature value, and that would give you this. And I believe this is in Kelvin, otherwise it'd be very, very warm in Seattle. This is how you can use the web request action to go and query and get data from an external source using query parameters in the URL string, and then query out that data for the values that you want to put in your workflow.